I don't know why I agreed to chaperone that school trip. I was just a teaching assistant, not even in charge of the kids, but when Mr. Harris called in sick, they needed someone to fill in at the last minute. It sounded simple enough. An overnight trip to Fort Pinewood, a historic site in the middle of nowhere. A bunch of old cabins, hiking trails, and some reenactments of Revolutionary War battles. Boring, but harmless. Or so I thought. The bus ride was fine. The kids, mostly 8th graders, were rowdy, but nothing unusual. When we arrived, the camp director, a wiry man with a permanent squint, greeted us with an unsettling smile. He handed me a map of the grounds and said, "Keep everyone together. The woods can get confusing." I shrugged it off, figuring he was trying to add some spooky flair for the kids. But as we unloaded, I noticed the place had an odd vibe. The cabins looked ancient, their wooden planks warped and blackened as if by fire. The air smelled damp, and even the sunlight seemed weaker, as though the trees were trying to snuff it out. After dinner, the camp director gathered us around a large fire pit. He began telling ghost stories about the fort, stories that made the kids laugh nervously and glance over their shoulders. But then he told one that stuck with me. He said that during the war, a deserter had been captured and executed right here on the grounds. According to legend, the man's spirit still wandered the woods, whispering to anyone who got too close to the edge of the property. "He's looking for company," the director said, his voice low and raspy. "Once you hear him, it's already too late." The kids ate it up, but I didn't like the way he looked at me when he said it. Later that night, after the kids had settled into their cabins, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks, and the stress of herding middle schoolers all day had me on edge. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the edge of the woods. The night was unnaturally quiet. No insects, no wind rustling the leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I found myself near the old battlefield, a clearing marked by faded plaques and weathered cannons. As I stood there, I felt a chill run through me, as though I were being watched. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was one of the kids messing around, but the sound was coming from deep in the woods. It was a low, raspy voice, almost like a chant. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent shivers down my spine. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal. But as I turned to head back, I saw something in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees. I froze. "All right, enough," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "If this is a prank, it's not funny." Silence, and then the voice returned. This time it was closer. "Stay with me." I ran. The flashlight's beam bounced wildly as I sprinted down the path, heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispering seemed to follow me, growing louder and more insistent. When I finally burst into the main camp, I was gasping for air. The cabins were dark, everyone asleep. I wanted to wake someone, to tell them what had happened, but I didn't want to look like a lunatic. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and forced myself to lie down in my bunk. But sleep wouldn't come. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside my cabin. Soft, deliberate steps circling the building. I sat up, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps stopped at the door, and for what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then the handle began to rattle. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The rattling stopped, but then the whispering started again. "Stay with me." I didn't dare move. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would burst. Finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. The next morning, I told the other teachers what had happened. Mr. Daniels, the lead teacher, laughed and said I'd probably just heard an animal or one of the kids sneaking out. But I noticed the camp director standing nearby, his squinting eyes fixed on me. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked away. I decided I couldn't take another night there. I told Mr. Daniels I wasn't feeling well and caught a ride back to town with the supply truck. As we drove away, I looked back at the camp and saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the woods was a figure, barely visible in the morning mist. It was tall and gaunt, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. And though it was too far to see clearly, I swear it was looking right at me. That was 2 years ago, and I still dream about that place. Sometimes I hear the whispering when I'm alone at night, even though I'm miles away from Fort Pinewood. And sometimes, when I wake up, I feel like I'm not alone. I don't know what happened out there, and I don't want to know. But if you ever visit that camp, do yourself a favor. Stay away from the woods.
Story number 2.
The school trip to the remote nature reserve was supposed to be a highlight of the year. Everyone was excited, including me, though I had my reservations. The place was called Black Hollow Reserve, a sprawling wilderness notorious for its dense woods and a history of eerie local legends. I should have trusted my gut, but I was too caught up in the excitement of the kids to back out. The first day was uneventful. The students, mostly 7th and 8th graders, spent the day hiking and doing nature activities. By nightfall, we were gathered around a bonfire, roasting marshmallows and listening to the guide, an older woman named Mrs. Whitaker. Her voice was calm but carried an unsettling weight as she spoke of the forest's history. Long ago, she began, Black Hollow wasn't a reserve. It was home to a small village. The settlers vanished without a trace one winter. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty houses and untouched meals left on tables. Locals believe the forest took them, that something out here doesn't want people staying too long. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the trees. If you hear someone call your name, especially from the woods, do not answer, no matter how familiar the voice sounds. The kids laughed nervously, but I noticed some of them stealing glances at the dark tree line. I forced myself to smile, even as a chill ran down my spine. That night, we settled into the cabins. The boys' and girls' cabins were on opposite sides of the clearing, with the chaperones in a smaller one between them. It wasn't luxurious, just thin walls, creaky bunk beds, and the faint smell of mildew, but it was enough for a night or two. I barely slept. The forest was eerily quiet, no wind, no crickets, nothing but the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was one of the kids sneaking out, but the steps were too heavy, deliberate. I got up, grabbing my flashlight, and peeked through the window. I expected to see one of the other teachers, but the clearing was empty. Then I heard it, a soft voice, faint but clear, calling my name. Miss Carter? It sounded like one of the students, a girl. My first thought was that someone had wandered off and needed help. I threw on a jacket and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The voice came again, faint and further away. Miss Carter, help me. I followed it, my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The voice led me toward the edge of the woods, and for a moment I hesitated. Mrs. Whitaker's warning replayed in my mind. Do not answer. But what if one of the kids was hurt? I couldn't risk ignoring it. I stepped into the woods, the trees closing in around me. The further I went, the quieter it became, as though the forest were swallowing all sound. The voice continued, drawing me deeper. Miss Carter, this way. It was strange. The voice didn't seem panicked or scared, just calm. Too calm. I stopped, shining my flashlight around. The beam fell on something up ahead, a figure standing between the trees. It looked like one of the girls, her back to me, her hair hanging loose over her shoulders. Emily? I called, recognizing one of the students. Is that you? She didn't move. Emily, what are you doing out here? Come on, we need to go back. She turned slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Emily. The figure looked like her, same hair, same clothes, but her face was wrong. Pale, stretched, and hollow, as though it were barely a mask over something else. Her eyes were dark voids, and when she smiled, her teeth were too sharp, too many. Stay with me, it whispered, its voice overlapping with Emily's, as though two people were speaking at once. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. The thing stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Stay. I ran. Branches scratched at my face and arms as I sprinted back toward the camp, the thing's voice echoing behind me. Miss Carter, don't leave. I didn't stop until I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath. The cabins were dark and silent, but as I approached the girl's cabin, I saw Emily peeking out from the window, her face pale with fear. What's going on? She whispered. I didn't answer. I just ushered her back inside and locked the door behind me. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I sat by the door, clutching a heavy flashlight like a weapon, jumping at every creak and rustle. When morning finally came, I told the other chaperones what had happened. Mr. Sanders, the lead teacher, looked skeptical but concerned. Mrs. Whitaker, on the other hand, simply nodded, as though she'd heard it all before. You're lucky you didn't answer, she said. If you had, well, let's just say we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wanted to leave immediately, but the trip wasn't scheduled to end until the next day. I spent the rest of the day on edge, keeping the kids close and avoiding the woods at all costs. That night, as we packed up to leave early, I overheard two of the boys talking in hushed voices. I heard it last night, one of them said. It called my name. Mine too. the other replied, his voice trembling, but it sounded like my mom. I interrupted, pulling them aside and making them promise not to go near the woods. They nodded, wide-eyed, and stuck close to the group for the rest of the trip. We left at dawn, the bus rumbling down the dirt road as the forest disappeared behind us. I thought that would be the end of it, but even now, months later, I can still hear that voice sometimes. Soft, faint, and unmistakable. Miss Carter, stay with me.
Story number 3.
When I signed the permission slip for the overnight school trip, I had no idea I was signing up for one of the most terrifying nights of my life. The destination was an old, historical estate nestled deep in the countryside. It was a sprawling property with an ancient manor, winding trails, and a lake shrouded in fog. The brochure described it as a place where history comes alive, but they failed to mention how literal that would become. I was one of 4 chaperones for the group of 30 students. Everything seemed normal when we arrived. The kids were thrilled to explore the grounds, their laughter echoing across the open fields. The estate staff gave us a tour of the manor, pointing out antiques and telling stories about its past residents. It was fascinating, but something about the place felt wrong. The walls seemed to whisper when no one was talking, and the air was heavy like the house was watching us. I kept brushing off the unease as an overactive imagination, but by the time we settled in for the night, my nerves were shot. The students were divided between 2 large dormitory-style rooms, boys in one, girls in the other. The chaperones were spread out to keep an eye on both groups. I was stationed with the boys, and by lights out, they were already buzzing with spooky stories about the manor. "There's a ghost here," one boy whispered. "The Lady of the Lake. She drowned herself when her husband left her, and now she haunts anyone who goes near the water." Another boy added, "No, it's the little boy who used to live here. They say he got locked in the attic and starved to death. At night, you can hear him crying." I told them to settle down, but their words stuck with me. After the kids finally fell asleep, I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building. Around midnight, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any of the kids. My heart started pounding as I got up to check. The hallway was empty, the floorboards creaking under my weight as I moved. At the far end of the hall was a narrow staircase leading up to the attic, roped off with a sign that read, "No entry." That's when I heard it. A faint, muffled crying. It was coming from above. I froze, staring at the attic door. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to wake the other chaperones, but I couldn't leave a student if they'd somehow wandered up there. I removed the rope and climbed the stairs, each step groaning louder than the last. The crying grew clearer, a soft, pitiful wail that sent chills down my spine. When I reached the top, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and the crying stopped the moment I touched it. I pushed it open slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The attic was empty. Dusty furniture and forgotten trunks filled the space, but no sign of anyone. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam trembling as I tried to calm my breathing. The handle wouldn't budge, and panic set in as I pounded on the door. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the attic, a small figure stood in the shadows. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy as they locked onto mine. "Help me," he whispered, his voice thin and hollow. Before I could respond, he turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Against my better judgment, I followed. The attic seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in as I chased the sound of his footsteps. Finally, I stumbled into a small, hidden room. The boy stood in the corner, facing the wall. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't move. I stepped closer, reaching out, but the moment my hand touched his shoulder, he turned. His face was a grotesque, hollowed-out mockery of what I'd seen before. Empty sockets stared back at me, and his mouth stretched into an unnatural, toothless grin. "You shouldn't have come," he hissed, his voice overlapping with another, deeper tone. The room plunged into darkness as my flashlight flickered and died. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in the hallway, the attic door swinging open behind me. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled back to the dormitory, my mind reeling. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the door, listening to the sounds of the house, whispers, footsteps, and the occasional faint cry from the attic. The next morning, I told the other chaperones what had happened. One of them, Mr. Hayes, admitted he'd heard the crying too, but thought it was just the wind. When we confronted the estate staff, they looked uncomfortable but brushed it off. "The manor has its quirks," one of them said. "Old houses make noise." I wasn't convinced, but I kept my mouth shut. We still had another night to get through. That evening, the kids were unusually quiet, their usual energy replaced by nervous whispers. One of the girls approached me, her face pale. "Miss Hart," she said, "can we leave? I saw someone in the hallway last night, but when I told the others, they didn't believe me." Before I could respond, another student chimed in. I heard crying. It was coming from the walls. I tried to reassure them, but my own fear was impossible to hide. That night, as I lay awake, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they didn't stop in the hallway. They came right to the door of the dormitory. The handle jiggled. I held my breath, clutching my flashlight, but the door didn't open. Instead, a shadow passed beneath it, and the footsteps moved on. The next morning, we packed up and left as quickly as possible. The bus ride back was quiet, the kids subdued and tired. No one wanted to talk about what had happened, but I could see the fear in their eyes. Weeks later, I got a call from one of the other chaperones. "Did you see the news?" she asked. I hadn't, so she sent me a link. It was an article about the estate, detailing its history and the tragic deaths of several children who'd lived there over the years. The attic, it turned out, was where they'd been locked away when they misbehaved. I haven't been on a school trip since. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the crying.
Story number 4.
The bus ride to Pine Hollow was full of excitement and chatter. It was the annual high school science trip, and this year the teachers had chosen to take us to a remote observatory nestled deep in the woods. For most of the kids, it was a dream. Campfires, stargazing, and 2 nights away from their parents. For me, it was just a chance to get away from the chaos of home. The observatory itself was stunning, perched on a hill overlooking an endless sea of trees. The building was a blend of old stone and modern architecture, and the guide who greeted us spoke passionately about the history of the place. Apparently, it had been built decades ago by an eccentric astronomer who became obsessed with searching for alien life. He disappeared mysteriously, and some claimed his ghost still roamed the grounds. Of course, my classmates lapped up the story, but I wasn't so amused. Ghost stories had never scared me. Real life was terrifying enough. That would change by the end of the trip. The first day was uneventful. We toured the observatory, set up our tents near the woods, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows. By the time night fell, the sky was so clear you could see every star in the Milky Way. It was breathtaking, and for a moment I forgot about the unease that had been creeping up my spine all day. It wasn't until after lights out that things took a turn. I shared a tent with my friend Alex, who was out cold as soon as his head hit the sleeping bag. I, however, couldn't sleep. The forest around us was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you can't ignore it. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural hum. At first, I thought it was some kind of animal, but it didn't sound like anything natural. It was rhythmic, like a deep, droning chant. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The campsite was still. The other tents were dark, and the campfire had burned down to embers. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the observatory. I told myself I was imagining things, but the hum grew louder. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for early autumn. I shivered as I walked toward the observatory, the beam of my flashlight bouncing with every step. The hum grew louder, vibrating in my chest, and I started to feel dizzy. When I reached the observatory, the door was slightly ajar, even though it had been locked earlier. I hesitated, but eventually pushed it open. The hum stopped. The silence inside was deafening, but I could feel something, a presence that made my skin crawl. The main hall was dark, save for the faint red glow of the exit signs. My footsteps echoed as I walked, every creak of the floorboards making me jump. I was about to turn back when I noticed a light coming from one of the side rooms. It was faint and flickering, like candlelight. I approached the room slowly, my heart pounding. The door was cracked open, and I could hear faint whispers. Peeking inside, I froze. There were 5 figures standing in a circle, their backs to me. They were dressed in robes that looked ancient, their hoods pulled low, and in the center of the circle was some kind of makeshift altar, with strange symbols carved into its surface. On top of it lay a small, shriveled object that looked like a heart. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic chorus. My flashlight flickered, and the beam landed on one of the symbols carved into the floor. It looked like an eye, but it seemed to blink when the light hit it. One of the robed figures turned, and though I couldn't see their face, I felt their gaze pierce through me. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and the whispers stopped abruptly. "Who's there?" A voice boomed, low and guttural, completely inhuman. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the sound of footsteps close behind me. I didn't dare look back. When I burst out of the observatory, the air felt thick, almost like I was wading through water. My legs felt heavy, and every step was a struggle. The hum returned, louder than before, and the trees around me seemed to sway, even though there was no wind. By the time I reached the campsite, everything was dark. The tents were still there, but the campfire was out. Felt wrong. "Alex?" I whispered, unzipping our tent. It was empty. Panic set in as I checked the other tents. They were all empty too. My classmates, the teachers, everyone was gone. I stood there, my breath fogging in the cold air, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I saw the figure at the edge of the woods. It was one of the robed people, their hood pulled back to reveal a face that was wrong in every way. Their skin was pale and stretched too tightly over their skull, and their eyes were empty sockets. They raised a hand, and the hum grew so loud it felt like my head would split open. I don't remember much after that. I woke up in my tent the next morning, Alex snoring beside me as if nothing had happened. The campsite was back to normal, and everyone acted like it had been an ordinary night. But I knew better. When we got back to school, I tried to tell someone, teachers, friends, anyone, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. Alex even joked that I'd eaten too many marshmallows and had a bad dream, but it wasn't a dream. A week later, I found a strange symbol carved into my bedroom window, the same eye I'd seen in the observatory. Every night since, I've heard the hum. It's getting louder.
Story number 5.
I've never been much of a fan of school trips, but this one was different. The moment our history teacher announced we'd be visiting the old Blackridge Manor, everyone in the class buzzed with excitement. The sprawling estate was infamous in our town for its dark past, a place rumored to be haunted by the spirits of its long-dead owners. I wasn't thrilled, but I didn't want to be the only one to back out, so I reluctantly signed the permission slip. What could possibly go wrong with a bunch of teens wandering around an abandoned mansion? The bus ride there was lively, but as we drew closer to the manor, the atmosphere shifted. The sky, clear just moments before, grew overcast, casting a gray shadow over the countryside. The manor itself came into view, its towering silhouette rising like a monument to decay. Blackridge Manor looked every bit as menacing as the stories made it out to be. Ivy choking the crumbling stone walls, windows broken like jagged teeth, and a sagging roof that groaned with the weight of time. Our guide, a wiry man with a permanent smirk, met us at the gates. He told us the usual ghost stories, how the original owner, a wealthy industrialist named Walter Blackridge, had mysteriously vanished along with his entire family one stormy night in 1892, how people claimed to hear whispers echoing through the halls, and how some swore they saw shadows moving even when the house was empty. I tried to brush it off as nonsense, but as we entered the manor, the air seemed to grow colder. The first hour was uneventful. We explored the vast, dust-covered rooms while the guide droned on about architecture and history. I stuck close to my friend Jenna, who shared my unease. "This place gives me the creeps," she whispered as we entered a room lined with cracked mirrors. "It feels like something's watching us." I nodded, trying to ignore the way the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't until we reached the basement that things started to feel wrong. The guide unlocked a heavy wooden door at the bottom of a narrow staircase and led us into a cavernous room that smelled of damp earth and mildew. The walls were lined with old shelves, cluttered with broken jars and rusted tools. In the center of the room stood an ancient wooden table, its surface gouged with deep scratches. "This," the guide announced, "is where the real mystery of Blackridge Manor begins." He went on to explain how this room was believed to have been Walter Blackridge's secret workshop, where he conducted strange experiments. Jenna nudged me. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing to the far corner of the room. I squinted. At first, I didn't see anything, but then it came into focus. A faint outline, like a shadow, but darker than it should have been. It was oddly shaped, hunched over as if it were crouching. Before I could say anything, the guide clapped his hands. "All right, folks, back upstairs," he said, clearly eager to keep us on schedule. I glanced back at the corner as we left, but the shadow was gone. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unease. The house seemed to creak and groan with every step, and more than once I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, always just at the edge of my vision. Jenna wasn't much better off. By the time the sun started to set, we were both ready to leave. But fate had other plans. As we were gathering near the bus to head home, the guide did a head count and realized someone was missing. It was Sam, one of the class clowns who'd spent the entire trip goofing off. "Probably got lost poking around," the guide muttered. "Stay here. I'll go find him." 15 minutes passed. Then 20. The guide didn't come back. Our teacher tried calling his phone, but there was no signal. Eventually, she decided we couldn't just stand around waiting. "Everyone back inside," she ordered, her voice shaky. Reluctantly, we filed back into the manor. The air inside felt heavier, almost suffocating. We split into groups to search, but it didn't take long before the eerie silence of the house started to get to us. Jenna and I were assigned to check the upper floor, which had been off limits during the tour. The staircase groaned under our weight as we climbed. The second floor was even more decrepit than the first, with warped floorboards and peeling wallpaper. "Sam?" Jenna called, her voice echoing down the hallway. There was no response. We checked room after room, but they were all empty. Then at the end of the hall, we came to a door that was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered inside. "Maybe he's in there," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Jenna pushed the door open, and we froze. The room was filled with old furniture, covered in white sheets, but what caught our attention was the figure standing by the window. It was Sam, or at least, it looked like him. His back was to us, and he was completely still. "Sam?" Jenna said cautiously. He didn't move. I stepped closer. "Hey man, we've been looking for you." The figure turned, and my heart dropped. It was Sam, but his eyes were wrong. They were completely black, voids that seemed to swallow the dim light in the room. His mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong on a human face. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice layered with something deep and guttural. Before we could react, the light in the room flickered and went out. The air turned icy, and I felt something brush past me, something cold and wet, like a hand made of shadows. Jenna screamed, and we bolted from the room. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly in both directions. Doors that had been closed were now wide open, and whispers filled the air, growing louder with every step. We ran blindly, finally bursting into the main hall where the rest of the group was huddled. "They're gone," someone sobbed. "The guide, the teacher, they're just gone." Before we could make sense of what was happening, the doors to the manor slammed shut. The whispers turned to screams, echoing from every corner of the house. And then we saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows. Their faces were pale and distorted, their eyes black voids like Sam's. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring our terror. We backed into a corner, clutching each other as the figures closed in. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, hear the low, guttural hum that seemed to emanate from deep within them. Just when it felt like all hope was lost, a blinding light filled the room. The figures recoiled, hissing like animals, and the front doors creaked open. Without hesitation, we ran, not stopping until we were back on the bus. The teacher and the guide were nowhere to be found. To this day, no one believes what happened at Blackridge Manor. The official story is that the guide and the teacher got lost in the woods, but we know the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window, and when I look, I see a shadow that doesn't belong.
Story number 6.
I didn't know what real fear was until the summer of my junior year in high school. Our biology teacher, Mr. Grayson, had organized a weekend camping trip to Cedar Lake, a chance to observe the ecosystem up close and earn some extra credit. I had no particular interest in the outdoors, but my best friend Marcus convinced me to go, promising it would be more fun than it sounded. We set out on a Friday afternoon, a group of 15 students, 2 chaperones, and Mr. Grayson leading the way in his old van packed with camping gear. The drive to Cedar Lake took 3 hours, most of it on winding roads that snaked through dense forest. The farther we got from the city, the patchier our cell service became. By the time we reached the campsite, our phones were nothing more than glorified flashlights. The campsite was nestled in a clearing by the lake, surrounded by towering pines. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Mr. Grayson divided us into groups to set up tents, collect firewood, and start preparing dinner. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lake glowed like molten gold. It should have been peaceful. But from the moment we arrived, I felt uneasy, like we were being watched. That first night, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. Mr. Grayson, ever the storyteller, shared a local legend about Cedar Lake. Back in the 1800s, there was a small logging community here, he began, his voice low and ominous. One winter, a storm cut them off from the nearest town. Food ran out. People grew desperate. Some say they resorted to unspeakable things to survive. The group leaned in closer, the fire casting flickering shadows on our faces. They say the forest holds their restless spirits. Wander too far from the campsite, and you might hear whispers calling you into the trees. But whatever you do, don't follow them. Most of the group laughed it off, but Marcus smirked and said, "Sounds like a challenge." I shot him a look. "Don't even think about it." That night, as we crawled into our sleeping bags, Marcus grinned at me. "Relax. It's just a story." I wasn't so sure. The next day was packed with activities, hiking, identifying plants, and sketching the lake. Marcus spent most of it goofing off, throwing rocks into the water and pretending to hear ghostly whispers. "Come on, man, this is boring," he complained as we trudged back to camp. "Let's go explore tonight. Just you and me. See if we can find those spirits." I hesitated. I don't think that's a good idea. But Marcus could be persuasive, and by the time night fell, he had me reluctantly agreeing to sneak out after everyone else was asleep. Around midnight, we slipped out of the tent, careful not to wake anyone. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every rustle of leaves sound like a roar. "Where should we go?" I whispered. Marcus pointed toward the far end of the lake, where the trees grew thicker. "There. Looks creepy enough." As we walked, the darkness seemed to close in around us. Our flashlights barely pierced the gloom, and the air grew colder with every step. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Marcus laughed, though it sounded forced. "What's the worst that could happen?" We didn't have to wait long to find out. About 20 minutes into our walk, we heard it, a faint, high-pitched whisper, like someone calling our names. "Did you hear that?" I froze, shining my flashlight into the trees. "Yeah," Marcus said, his bravado faltering. "Probably just the wind." But the whisper came again, clearer this time. It was definitely saying our names, drawing them out in a sing-song voice. "Marcus, Alex, let's go back," I said, panic rising in my chest. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. We turned around, but the path we'd been following was gone. The forest seemed different, the trees closer together, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "We didn't come this way," I said, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Marcus didn't answer. He was staring ahead, his face pale. "What is it?" he pointed, and I followed his gaze. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its head tilted to one side as though it were studying us. "Who's there?" Marcus called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. "Let's go." I grabbed Marcus's arm and started running. The whispers grew louder, surrounding us, mingling with laughter that didn't sound human. The ground seemed to shift beneath our feet, the trees blurring into a dark maze. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually we burst into a clearing. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't our campsite. It was a different part of the forest, the lake glimmering faintly in the distance. Marcus doubled over, gasping for breath. "What the hell is going on?" Before I could answer, a cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying the stench of decay. The laughter returned, louder this time, and the figure stepped out from the shadows. It was closer now and harsh, and I could see its face, or what was left of it. Its skin was gray and rotting, its eyes empty sockets that seemed to suck in the darkness. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. "You shouldn't be here," it hissed, its voice a chilling blend of male and female tones. We stumbled back, but the figure didn't follow. Instead, it raised one twisted hand and pointed toward the lake. "Leave," it said, "before it's too late." We didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted toward the lake, the whispers and laughter fading behind us. When we finally reached the campsite, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. No one noticed we'd been gone. Marcus and I never spoke about what happened that night. We both dropped biology the following semester and avoided each other for the rest of high school. I've tried to forget, but sometimes late at night I hear whispers outside my window, and in the distance I see a figure standing just beyond the trees, watching.
Story number 7.
When I agreed to chaperone my younger sister's field trip, I thought it would be a simple day of wrangling overexcited kids and snapping photos of them pretending to pay attention to exhibits. The trip was to the old Claymore Estate, a sprawling 19th century mansion turned historical site known for its ghostly folklore. I didn't believe in any of it, but by the end of that day, I wished I had. The morning started normally enough. The kids piled off the bus, jittery with energy, while teachers and parents organized them into manageable groups. The estate guide, a gaunt woman with piercing eyes, welcomed us with a tight-lipped smile. "Please stay with your groups," she said in a voice that carried an edge of warning. "The house is large, and it's easy to get lost. And remember," she added, her gaze sweeping over the kids, "some things are better left undisturbed." The kids giggled nervously, but I felt an uneasy weight settle in my stomach. The house was massive, every inch of it oozing old money and secrets. Ornate chandeliers hung from the ceilings, their crystals catching the sunlight in strange ways. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the floors creaked with every step. Our guide led us through the main rooms, reciting facts about the Claymore family and their tragic history. The part that caught my attention was about the youngest daughter, Eleanor. She had vanished one stormy night, never to be seen again. Her disappearance sparked wild rumors. Some claimed she had been murdered by a jealous sibling. Others whispered she had been taken by something inhuman. The guide didn't linger on the details, but I noticed her eyes darting to the staircase as she spoke. My group consisted of my sister, Emma, and 3 other kids. Emma, being the curious 12-year-old she was, latched onto the story of Eleanor. "What do you think happened to her?" she asked me as we wandered through the dimly lit dining hall. "I think she probably ran away," I said, trying to sound casual. Emma wasn't convinced. "What if she's still here? Like a ghost?" I rolled my eyes, but didn't reply. The truth was the house was starting to get to me. The air felt heavy, and the shadows seemed to shift when you weren't looking. After lunch, the kids were allowed some free time to explore the garden. But Emma and her new friend Mia had other plans. "Let's check out the upstairs," Emma whispered, tugging my arm. "No one else is going up there." I hesitated. The upstairs portion of the house was roped off, but the guide had mentioned it was mostly unused storage. Still, something about the way Emma's voice echoed in the hallway made me uneasy. "Just for a minute," I said, "and stay close." The 4 of us slipped past the rope and crept up the staircase. The second floor was noticeably colder, the air stale and thick. Dust covered every surface, and the dim light from a single window did little to dispel the gloom. "This is so cool," Mia whispered, her eyes wide as she peered into a room filled with old furniture draped in white sheets. Emma pushed open another door, revealing a bedroom. The bed frame was wrought iron, and the wallpaper was peeling, but it was the mirror on the dresser that caught my attention. It was large and oval, its surface smudged with age, and for a moment I thought I saw something move within it. I blinked, and it was gone. "This must have been Eleanor's room," Emma said, stepping inside. "All right, we've seen enough," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Let's go back downstairs." But Emma wasn't listening. She moved to the dresser and picked up a small hairbrush. "It's so old. Do you think it's hers?" Before I could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. The sound was deafening, and the kids screamed. I ran to the door and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Stop messing around," I snapped, thinking one of them was playing a prank. "It wasn't us," Emma cried, her face pale. "It just closed." The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in the air. A low, faint humming began to fill the space, and I turned to see Mia staring at the mirror, her eyes wide with terror. "Someone's in there," she whispered. I looked, and my stomach twisted. A pale figure stood in the mirror's reflection, her long, tangled hair falling over a thin white dress. Her face was blurred, but her eyes, they were black pits, empty and endless. "Get away from the mirror," I shouted, grabbing the kids and pulling them toward the corner of the room. The humming grew louder, morphing into a shrill, piercing wail. The figure in the mirror began to move, her skeletal hand reaching toward us through the glass. Emma screamed, and the hairbrush fell from her hand, hitting the floor with a sharp clatter. The figure stopped abruptly, her head snapping toward the brush. For a split second, everything was silent. Then the mirror shattered. Glass flew across the room, and the lights flickered wildly. The figure was gone, but the oppressive cold remained. I threw my weight against the door again, and this time it flew open. We bolted down the hallway and back to the main staircase, our footsteps echoing like gunshots. When we reached the first floor, the guide was waiting for us, her face pale and her mouth set in a grim line. "You went upstairs," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, struggling to catch my breath. "There's something up there." "I know," she interrupted. "And you're lucky it let you leave." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. We gathered the rest of the kids and left the estate earlier than planned. Emma and Mia didn't say much on the bus ride home, and I didn't press them. I was too busy replaying the events in my mind, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But that night, as I lay in bed, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On my nightstand was the hairbrush Emma had picked up in Eleanor's room. I knew I hadn't taken it, and when I touched it, the air around me grew ice cold.
Story number 8.
It was supposed to be a bonding experience, our senior class trip to the infamous Hollow Creek Forest. The forest was notorious in local lore for its strange disappearances and ghostly sightings, but for a bunch of 17-year-olds, it was more of a thrilling dare than a reason for concern. I wish we'd taken the warnings seriously. The trip started on a crisp fall morning. The buses dropped us off near a rustic cabin that served as the ranger station. The air was cool, and the leaves crunched beneath our feet as we unloaded our gear. Our teachers gave a quick briefing about safety and emphasized sticking to the marked trails. "Don't wander off," Mr. Stanton said firmly. "The forest is denser than it looks, and the trails can be deceptive." We all nodded, but I could see the glint of rebellion in some of my classmates' eyes. Rules, especially on a class trip, were meant to be bent. After setting up our campsite, we spent the day hiking, taking pictures, and joking around. The forest was beautiful but eerie, with its towering trees and thick canopy that filtered the sunlight into faint, dappled patches. As the sun began to set, the mood shifted. The shadows stretched longer, and the cheerful chatter of the group dwindled. Even the teachers seemed on edge. That night, we gathered around a campfire, swapping ghost stories and eating s'mores. When my friend Lizzie suggested a night hike, a few of us eagerly agreed. It sounded like the perfect way to up the adrenaline. There were 6 of us: Lizzie, her boyfriend Mark, his best friend Jason, my best friend Clara, and me. Armed with flashlights and a questionable sense of adventure, we ventured into the dark forest, ignoring the teacher's warnings. The first 20 minutes were exciting. We laughed nervously at the sounds of snapping twigs and hooted like owls to spook each other. But the deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that pressed against our ears. "Guys, maybe we should head back," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lizzie rolled her eyes. "Don't chicken out now. We've barely started." But even Mark, who was usually the loudest, looked uneasy. "Maybe Clara's right. It's getting late." Before we could decide, Jason froze. "Did you hear that?" We all stopped, holding our breath. At first, I heard nothing, but then there it was, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone knocking on a hollow tree. It was distant but deliberate, growing louder with each tap. "Probably just a woodpecker," Lizzie said, but her voice wavered. "Woodpeckers don't tap at night," Jason muttered. Mark swung his flashlight toward the trees, and we all squinted into the darkness. At first, there was nothing but an endless wall of black. Then I saw it, a figure standing between the trees. It was hard to make out, but it looked human, motionless, and watching us. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice cracking. He tried to sound brave, but his hand trembled, making the beam of his flashlight jitter. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, like a shadow peeled from the darkness. Then, as if it were never there, it was gone. "Okay, that's it. We're going back," I said, my voice shaking. No one argued. We turned and started walking back the way we came, or at least we thought we were. The trail looked unfamiliar in the dark, and the trees seemed closer together, their branches reaching like skeletal arms. "Are we lost?" Clara asked, panic creeping into her voice. "No, we just need to." Jason stopped mid-sentence, staring ahead. In the middle of the path stood a small, light, decrepit cabin that hadn't been there before. Its wooden walls were weathered and splintered, and the windows were nothing more than gaping black holes. "Was this here earlier?" Lizzie whispered. "No," I said firmly. "We're going around it." But as we tried to skirt the cabin, the tapping sound returned, louder, closer, and coming from inside. It wasn't a knock. It was more like someone was hammering their fists against the walls. The noise was relentless, echoing through the trees and filling my chest with dread. "Run!" Mark shouted, and we bolted. Branches scratched at our faces, and roots threatened to trip us, but we didn't stop. The forest seemed alive, shifting and twisting to keep us trapped. The cabin appeared again, right in front of us, no matter which direction we ran. This time the door was open. Inside, the darkness seemed to pulse, like a living thing waiting to swallow us whole. Then came a sound that made my blood freeze, a voice, low and guttural, calling our names. Not all at once, but one by one, each name stretched out like a mocking taunt. Lizzie, Mark, Clara! I couldn't take it anymore. We have to go in, I said, hating myself even as the words left my mouth. It's the only way. Are you insane? Jason hissed. We'll die in there. We'll die out here too, Clara said, tears streaming down her face. It's not letting us leave. Reluctantly, we stepped inside. The air was thick and suffocating, carrying the stench of rot. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The cabin was empty, save for a single chair in the center of the room. On it sat a doll, old and tattered, its porcelain face cracked and its eyes missing. As we approached, the door slammed shut behind us. The walls began to tremble, and the tapping returned, louder than ever, coming from everywhere at once. The doll's head snapped toward us, and its mouth opened wide, far wider than any humans could. A guttural scream erupted from it, shaking the cabin to its foundation. Lizzie collapsed, clutching her ears, while Jason banged on the door, screaming for help. I grabbed Clara's hand and shouted, "We have to destroy it!" Mark grabbed a piece of wood and swung it at the doll, smashing it to pieces. For a moment, everything stopped, the screaming, the tapping, even the tremors. Then, from the shards of the doll, a black, smoky figure began to rise. It had no discernible features, but its presence was suffocating. "Run!" Clara yelled, and we did. The door flew open, and we sprinted into the forest. This time, the trees seemed to part for us, and the distant lights of the campsite came into view. We didn't stop until we were surrounded by the others, gasping for breath and unable to explain what had happened. The teachers scolded us for leaving the group, but I barely heard them. My mind was stuck on the cabin and the figure that had followed us. The next morning, we left Hollow Creek. As the bus pulled away, I glanced back at the forest and froze. There, between the trees, stood the cabin, its door ajar, as if inviting us back.
Story number 9.
When I signed up for the weekend retreat with my college hiking club, I thought it would be a relaxing escape from the grind of exams. It was supposed to be simple. Spend 2 days hiking the trails around Whispering Pines, a remote forest in the Appalachian foothills. Little did I know, the name would turn out to be far more literal than I ever imagined. The group consisted of 10 of us, including the 2 trip leaders, Sarah and Kevin, who had been to Whispering Pines before. The first day was uneventful. The trails were beautiful, the air crisp, and the autumn leaves painted the landscape in hues of orange and red. By dusk, we'd reached our campsite, a clearing surrounded by towering pines. After dinner, we sat around the campfire, telling stories and laughing as the stars appeared overhead. Someone brought up the legend of the Whispering Pines, a local tale about spirits that lured travelers into the forest with soft voices. According to the story, once you heard the whispers, they would haunt you forever. "Let me guess," Sarah said with a smirk. "If you follow the whispers, you disappear." "Exactly," replied Liam, one of the guys who'd grown up near the area. "People have claimed to hear them at night. They say the forest rearranges itself, trapping you until, well, no one knows what happens after that. Creepy, but total nonsense," Kevin said confidently, tossing another log onto the fire. We all laughed it off, but later that night, as I lay in my tent listening to the wind rustling through the trees, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of faint voices outside. At first, I thought it was just Sarah and Kevin talking, but as I strained to listen, I realized the voices weren't coming from the campsite. They were soft, melodic, almost hypnotic, drifting in from deeper within the forest. I sat up, my heart racing. The sound wasn't loud, but it felt wrong. It was like the voices were calling to me, beckoning me to come closer. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease, and covered my ears. The next morning, I asked if anyone else had heard the whispers. Most people dismissed it as the wind, but Liam looked pale. "I heard them too," he admitted. "I thought it was just my imagination." Sarah and Kevin brushed it off, assuring us that the forest was full of natural sounds that could be misleading. Still, I noticed that Liam and I stuck close to the group during the day's hike. As we ventured further into the woods, the atmosphere grew heavier. The trees were denser, their gnarled branches casting twisted shadows on the ground. By late afternoon, we reached a section of the forest where the air was unnaturally still. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but an oppressive silence. "This doesn't feel right," I whispered to Liam. He nodded, his eyes scanning the tree line. I know, it's like the forest is watching us. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. This time, it wasn't just me and Liam who heard them. One by one, others in the group woke up, their faces pale with fear. Do you hear that? Emily, one of the quieter members of the group, asked. Her voice trembled as she clutched her sleeping bag. It's just the wind, Kevin said, though his tone lacked conviction. But it wasn't the wind. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the trees and circling the campsite like a predator. They weren't speaking any language I recognized, but their intent was clear. They wanted us to follow. We need to leave, Liam said firmly. Now. Sarah hesitated, but eventually agreed. We packed up quickly, leaving the campsite in chaos as we stumbled through the dark forest with only our flashlights to guide us. The whispers didn't fade as we walked. Instead, they seemed to grow closer, more urgent, like they were inside our heads. The forest, once familiar, now felt alien. The trails we'd followed earlier were gone, replaced by an endless maze of identical trees. Where are we? Emily cried, her voice breaking. This isn't the way we came. I don't know. Sarah admitted, panic creeping into her voice. Just keep moving. Then we saw it. A cabin standing in the middle of the forest. It looked ancient, its wooden walls warped and its windows cracked. That wasn't there before? Kevin said, his flashlight shaking in his hand. We're not going in there, Sarah said, but the whispers grew deafening, pushing us toward the cabin. It was as if the forest itself was herding us into that cursed structure. Against our better judgment, we entered. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the metallic scent of decay. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and the walls were etched with strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of our flashlights. What is this place? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. Don't move, Liam said, his eyes wide with terror. Then we saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the walls, their forms twisting and flickering like smoke. They had no eyes, but I could feel their gaze piercing through me. The room grew colder as they closed in, their whispers returning, louder and more menacing. They weren't just voices anymore. They were inside my head, clawing at my thoughts and filling me with an overwhelming sense of despair. We need to get out of here, Kevin shouted, but the door wouldn't budge. The shadows swirled around us, their whispers reaching a fever pitch. One of them lunged at Emily, and she screamed, collapsing to the floor. We tried to pull her up, but it was like she was rooted to the spot, her eyes wide and unblinking. Help me, she mouthed, but no sound came out. Desperate, Liam grabbed a lantern hanging on the wall and hurled it at the shadows. The glass shattered and the flames erupted, momentarily pushing the figures back. This way, Sarah shouted, kicking open a window. We scrambled out, dragging Emily with us. The forest was alive with movement, the shadows chasing us as we ran. The whispers were everywhere, but they were different now, angrier. After what felt like hours, we burst out of the forest and onto the gravel road where our van was parked. The shadows didn't follow us past the tree line, but their whispers lingered in the back of my mind, a haunting reminder of what we'd escaped. We never spoke about what happened that night, not even when Emily dropped out of college a week later. Liam and I stayed in touch for a while, but he eventually stopped responding to my messages. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers.
Story number 10.
It started with a dare, like all the worst ideas do. My friends and I were on a road trip through the Midwest when we heard about the abandoned Greystone Asylum. It wasn't on any official map, just a pin dropped on some urban explorer's blog with the words, "Enter at your own risk." The asylum had closed in the 1950s under mysterious circumstances. Rumors swirled about unethical experiments and patients disappearing, but no one could prove anything. Locals claimed the place was haunted, cursed even, and avoided it at all costs. Naturally, we couldn't resist. The road to the asylum was rough, overgrown with weeds and potholes that rattled our old van. By the time we reached the iron gates, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the decrepit building. The place was massive, its gray stone walls looming like a fortress against the darkening sky. "This is so stupid," Rachel muttered as we climbed out of the van. "Relax," Mark said, slinging an arm around her. "It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" "Famous last words," I muttered, but I followed them through the gates anyway. The front doors were chained shut, but a side window had been smashed open long ago. We climbed through one by one, landing in what used to be the reception area. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and mildew. Peeling wallpaper revealed veiled graffiti scrawled by past visitors, and the floor was littered with broken glass and debris. We turned on our flashlights, their beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. "All right," Mark said, grinning. "Let's split up and explore. Meet back here in an hour." Rachel immediately protested, but Mark was already heading down a hallway, pulling Jake along with him. That left me with Rachel and Olivia. "Let's stick together," I suggested, not wanting to wander alone. We chose a different hallway and started exploring. The place was a labyrinth of decaying rooms, their purposes long forgotten. One had rusted bed frames stacked against the walls. Another had filing cabinets overturned, their contents strewn across the floor. "This is creepy as hell," Olivia whispered, her voice echoing in the empty corridor. "It's just a building," I said, though I didn't believe it. There was something wrong about the place, a heaviness that seemed to press down on us the deeper we went. Then we heard it, a faint sound like someone crying. We froze, our flashlights flickering as we strained to listen. "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, the crying grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from one of the rooms ahead. "We should go back," Olivia said, backing away. But something compelled me forward, a morbid curiosity I couldn't resist. I approached the door where the sound was coming from, pushing it open slowly. The room was empty, save for a single wheelchair in the center, its metal frame rusted and its seat torn. The crying stopped as soon as we entered. "Let's go," Rachel urged, tugging at my arm. I nodded, but as we turned to leave, the wheelchair moved. It was subtle at first, a slight creak as it rocked back and forth, but then it rolled toward us, its wheels screeching against the floor. We screamed and bolted, running blindly down the hallway until we collided with Mark and Jake. "What the hell happened?" Mark demanded. "The wheelchair. It moved on its own," Rachel panted, her face pale. "Calm down," Mark said. "You're just spooked. This place is falling apart, probably a draft or something." "No," I said firmly. "It wasn't the wind. Something's wrong here." But Mark brushed it off, insisting we keep exploring. Reluctantly, we followed him, sticking closer together this time. The deeper we went, the worse the air felt. It was cold now, unnaturally so, and our flashlights struggled to pierce the gloom. We came across a staircase leading to the basement, its steps crumbling with age. "We're not going down there," Rachel said firmly. But Mark, ever the thrill-seeker, was already descending. Jake followed him, and after a tense moment, the rest of us did too. The basement was even darker than the floors above, the walls slick with moisture. The faint scent of decay hung in the air, making me gag. We found ourselves in a large room lined with rusted metal tables. Chains hung from the ceiling, their ends frayed as if something had been ripped free. "What is this place?" Olivia whispered. "It's probably where they did experiments," Jake said, his voice barely audible. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging the room into total darkness. "Who did that?" Mark shouted, but no one answered. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, overlapping until it was impossible to tell how many voices there were. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, their tones filled with malice. "Is this a joke?" Mark demanded, his bravado cracking. "It's not us!" I shouted back, panic rising in my chest. The whispers grew deafening, and then the tables started to move. They scraped across the floor, forming a circle around us. The chains swung wildly, clanging against each other. "We need to get out of here!" Rachel screamed. We ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into screams, high-pitched and inhuman, echoing through the room. Then we saw them, figures emerging from the walls, their forms barely human. Their faces were featureless, their bodies twisted and contorted as if in agony. One of them reached for Jake, its elongated fingers brushing his arm. He screamed, collapsing to the floor. "Help me!" he cried, but when I tried to pull him up, it was like he was glued to the spot. The figures closed in, their hollow faces inches from ours. I grabbed a rusted pipe from the floor and swung it wildly, but it passed through them like smoke. "This isn't real," I whispered, but it felt all too real. Rachel found a loose brick and smashed it against the window on the far wall. The glass shattered, and we scrambled through, cutting ourselves on the jagged edges. Outside, the air was freezing, but the whispers had stopped. The asylum loomed behind us, its windows glowing faintly as if lit from within. "Where's Jake?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. We turned, but he wasn't with us. The last we saw of him was in that room, surrounded by those things. We wanted to go back to try to save him, but the whispers started again, louder this time, echoing through the forest. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached the van, and even then, it took several tries before the engine sputtered to life. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The asylum was gone. We never found Jake. The police searched the area but found no trace of him or the asylum. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window.